I wasn't looking to join an accelerator. I didn't apply to YC. I didn't do any of those things. For me, I was very focused on, I want to start a company. I've been co-founder dating for a few months, and being in a room with other people who have also all quit their jobs and are looking to start a company seems like a faster way to start a company and co-founder date, right? And then on top of that, when Antler talked to me about what they look for in a founder and why, and like their thoughts on the space, I actually really, really agreed with that. And then that made me so much more interested in Antler than just like a space to find a co-founder, right?
Yeah, that's one way that we're different than a lot of other investors and accelerator programs is we bring in big cohorts. We're still highly selective. We've got about a 2% acceptance rate, but we can't invest in everyone. We don't have enough capital for that. So over the course of those 8 weeks, we spend the time to get to know the founders and then use those insights and the conviction that we build throughout that time to make investment decisions. And we'll end up investing in usually the top 10 to 20% of each cohort. There's no kind of hard targets. It can be much lower. It can also be much higher. But typically we see out of like 75 founders, we'll invest in, between 10 and 20 deals. I think in the spring program that Sabina was a part of, we ended up investing in 13 founders out of, I think, like 60 teams.
Welcome to Inside the Deal, the podcast where we explore how funding rounds come to fruition from start to close. I'm Adam Hardy from Sandhill Markets.
And I'm Steph Moy from PIN. Our head of growth, Daniel Wiegand, and I are teaming up to host this podcast with Sandhill Markets. Together, we sit down and discuss the intricacies of how venture funding rounds come together.
Tune in to hear how investments are formalized from both the founder and investor perspectives, from initial conversations to final close.
Whether you're an investor or founder curious about the fundraising process, please enjoy the episode.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of Inside the Deal. I'm your host, Daniel, and today I am joined by Sabina Hemmi from GLP Winner and Jake O'Shea from Antler. Thank you guys both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Sabina, let's start with you. Just for context for the audience, would love to hear a little bit more about your background in GLP Winner, and then Jake will ask you the same.
Yeah. So I live in Austin. I'm a second-time founder. I'm a college dropout, and I used to lead one of the top World of Warcraft guilds in the US and world. We're like number one in the US, top 3 in the world.
That's awesome.
Approximately 13 years ago, I started a company doing data and analytics for video games. We were bootstrapped. We took a Series A from private equity, and the company is still operating and profitable. We're best known for high traffic consumer sites, 6 million monthly active users. Absolutely huge. And I took a year and a half off. I'm still on the board between that and starting something new. So obviously met Jake working on GLP Winner. What GLP Winner does is basically what Kayak does for flights and travel. We do, but connecting consumers to weight loss providers, specifically around GLP-1 medications, which is the weight loss shot, Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound, and compounded versions of that drug. Currently, there's 15 million people taking those medications. We're expecting it to be 70 million in the next 4 years. Most people's insurance does not cover it or will not cover it continuously. So a lot of people are paying out of pocket, and the price range for that tends to be between $200 and $1,500 per month. And it's really, really hard to shop around. I was paying $875 per month, and I knew I was overpaying, but it was so hard to shop around. So GLP Winner basically provides the first place where consumers can compare and see where people are licensed in their state and where the medication is coming from, and full transparency.
Awesome. And Jake, tell us a little bit more. I think most people know Antler, but would love to hear from your words a little bit more about your background in Antler and the program that you guys run. I know you guys are really all over the place.
So I grew up in Houston, Texas, came to Austin initially to study at UT, fell in love with startups through an internship, and then out of school got a job at Capital Factory, a local accelerator. Worked my way up from a coordinator to head of platform there, really helping structure all the value delivery for their portfolio companies. Spent a few years at a Bay Area firm, Foundation Capital, doing the same thing, building out their platform and portfolio support function. And then joined the team at Antler here, in Austin, was really excited by their focus and the gap that they're filling in the Texas startup ecosystem. So Antler is a pre-seed investment fund, and the way that we do diligence on our founders is through these 8-week founder residencies, where we actually fill our office space physically with 70 to 90 smart, ambitious founders, all committed to building something big and exciting and venture scale. We work with them really in depth over the course of those 8 weeks, get to know them, the market they're tackling, how they think, how they talk to customers, how they approach company building, and then use those insights to make effective investments in week 7 and week 8. And so that's how I initially met Sabina. And what drew me to Antler was very, very early stage capital in Texas. There's some, but there's not enough. And also just the opportunity to be very broad and work with all sorts of founders, whether it's consumer healthcare like Sabina, or I've invested in a 3D printing company, consumer fintech, enterprise AI. It's really founder driven and founder focused. And that's one of the things that attracted me to it.
Super interesting. And so you guys don't make investment decisions at the beginning.
Yeah, so that's one way that we're different than a lot of other investors and accelerator programs is we bring in big cohorts. We're still highly selective. We've got about a 2% acceptance rate, but we can't invest in everyone. We don't have enough capital for that. So over the course of those 8 weeks, we spend the time to get to know the founders and then use those insights and the conviction that we build throughout that time to make investment decisions. And we'll end up investing in usually the top 10 to 20% of each cohort. There's no kind of hard targets. It can be much lower. It can also be much higher. But typically we see out of like 75 founders, we'll invest in, between 10 and 20 deals. I think in the spring program that Sabina was a part of, we ended up investing in 13 founders out of, I think, like 60 teams.
Very cool. Yeah. And so this is definitely a unique one because there's almost like, for us in this podcast, the purpose is to, rediscover how that first meeting came together and how that first meeting happened and all of that. And so for this, it's almost like two-part. So would love to start with sort of that initial selection process, assuming it's just people are submitting applications. From your end, Jake, what was it about Sabina's application that really just got through that first layer as far as, all of the applications I'm sure you guys are getting?
Definitely getting tons of applications. Sabina actually was introduced through a mutual friend of ours, a guy named Eric Hinnenhofer. He's a serial entrepreneur, very highly regarded in the ecosystem. I knew Eric from my time at Capital Factory and actually had known Sabina from Capital Factory as well. She was a mentor there. And so we had never connected directly, but I knew of her in a way. And so when Eric reached out and said, "Hey, Sabina's going to start a new company. I think you should talk to her about Antler," I was like, "Absolutely, let's set it up." So invited her to come out to our office in downtown Austin. We sat down on a couch in our living room and really tried to spend that first meeting just getting to know her. I knew she had started a successful business in the past, was just kind of curious to learn more about her background and what's now leading her to start a new business. And that's really what we try to dig into at Antler is what's driving you, what's motivating you to do the objectively really difficult thing of becoming a venture-backed startup founder. Kind of where do your motivations lie? Where does your interest lie? What are the areas you're excited about? Where do you see the market going? And what opportunities does that create for you to potentially start a business? And the business now that Sabina is running, GLP Winner, is fairly different than what we talked about that first meeting. And that's another way that I think Antler is unique in that we're not underwriting a specific product and go-to-market strategy. We're really underwriting the founder and their ability to navigate within a space, in this case, consumer healthcare, and figure out what do customers want? What are the value propositions I can create that help give it to them? And then we're investing in that thought process because we know that then they'll be able to figure out how to productize that and continue scaling it down the road. That's ultimately what we're underwriting throughout the residency.
Yeah, definitely. So definitely a unique circumstance here, Sabina. So going into that first meeting with Jake, how much did you know about Antler? How did you approach that meeting? And what were your thoughts or the thoughts going through your head? Were you going to pitch or was it just conversation?
Yeah, it was interesting because leading up to that, because the cohort started in April and we maybe met like 2 weeks before the cohort started, I had been co-founder dating since January, right? And so I thought I had a good idea of an idea in space that I was excited about. But I was honestly putting off some decisions because I was waiting to find my co-founder and make those together and make sure that we had 100% alignment and buy-in. So it was funny though, because I feel like me meeting Jake was like fate, because what ended up happening was I co-founder dated some people. They were like, hey, we should do Antler. You need to meet Jake. And then I would run into other entrepreneurs around Austin because I'm really close friends with a bunch of them. And they would be like, have you talked to Jake yet? This sounds perfect. Right. So out of the blue, a friend just like made the group DM on LinkedIn and was like, you guys need to talk. But it felt like it was inevitable that I was going to meet Jake regardless, because he's so active in the Austin ecosystem. We have a bunch of mutual people that we know. And it was like inevitable that I was going to have a conversation with him. And I did know the cohort was going to start the beginning of April. So I was like, okay, well, I need to do this. And then I think going into the first meeting, it was quite atypical. And I kind of remember the rough script of what I said, because like I did not have a deck. A deck did not exist.
Yeah.
Right. I remember when I went in, I sort of was like, okay, here's why I'm dumb enough to be an entrepreneur. Like, here's the weird quirks about me that make me need to do this. And then I was like, here's my theses, almost like a VC would, where here's the trends I see going on that I'm excited about. And then the third part was like, this is the solution that I think I want to explore building. Right. So very, very early, but that was like the rough script that it followed. And I think we went over time. I think there were other founders who had got less time because we went over time because of that. But yeah.
Jake mentioned you pivoted, or maybe like slightly pivot. What did it start out as? Or is it kind of in the same realm, but just maybe slightly different? Or
I would say it's completely different, but half of my theses still stand. Right. So when I came in, I wanted to do something in consumer healthcare because healthcare doesn't work for consumers. I was also focused on, which it's not necessarily applicable to my current company, I was focused on like the rise of like complex diagnoses, autoimmune diseases. I was also focused on like what I would call the gray wave of like boomers starting to retire, and then they would need help with that. And my new company doesn't have anything to do with those other things. Right. But the rest of it, the consumer healthcare kind of angle. And I didn't know this then, but I know it now. Like there's a long history of people coming from consumer to healthcare, right? The challenge of healthcare is understanding the landscape. But like, for example, the founders of like Sesame, GoodRx, those were consumer people who came to healthcare and they were like, we need to make this better for consumers. So in that sense, it was totally aligned, but the practical sense of like what we were actually building, completely different products.
How long into the program did you guys make that pivot?
2 weeks. And also I met my co-founder in the program.
Oh, perfect.
I met my co-founder on day one. It took us like a week to be like, okay, we're exclusive and we're working on this. And then 2 weeks in, we pivoted. And then 2 weeks from the pivot, we had researched the space and launched a prototype and got it in front of like 1,000 users.
Super interesting. And Jake, how long is the program? And are they all the same?
Yeah, they're all the same length. They last 8 weeks, but the bulk of it is the first 6 weeks. The last 2 weeks are just pitching to the investment committee to get the ultimate investment. There's not a ton of structure. I'd say the first week is the most programming heavy, and that's like introductions to who Antler is, how to make the most of this time, things like that. But weeks kind of 2 through 6, there's, we'll usually have some sort of like topic where the team will talk about go-to-market strategy or fundraising or customer interviews or things like that. We'll usually have like one external speaker, again, talking about some functional area of building the business. And then all we do on the investment team the entire 6 weeks is just back-to-back one-on-one office hours with the founders. So really diving deep into what's going well, what's not, how can we roll up our sleeves and help, who can we connect you with that might be relevant as you continue exploring this space. And the rest of the time, they're just building their company, but they're doing it in our space, surrounded by 70 other founders at the exact same stage. And that's kind of the format of the program and what it looks like.
Yeah. And so Sabina, from your end, was there anything in particular about Antler that got you excited to join? Obviously the network is incredible, but would love to hear just sort of your thoughts, especially, I don't want to say unsure about the direction of the company, but just so early. Curious your thoughts about joining Antler in the first place.
I wasn't looking to join an accelerator. I didn't apply to YC. I didn't do any of those things. For me, I was very focused on, I want to start a company. I've been co-founder dating for a few months, and being in a room with other people who have also all quit their jobs and are looking to start a company seems like a faster way to start a company and co-founder date, right? And then on top of that, I think I was extremely pleasantly surprised that when I spoke to Antler, I actually agreed with like almost everything they said about entrepreneurship and what they look for in a founder and all of that, right? Because, for the last 4 years, I've been a mentor at Capital Factory. And so I'm constantly seeing early founders. And a lot of people who are in that position, they can tell you like, hey, 70% of people you might encounter, like you might be like, I can tell you're going to fail. I can tell what you're doing wrong, like very much that. So when Antler talked to me about what they look for in a founder and why, and like their thoughts on the space, I actually really, really agreed with that. And then that made me so much more interested in Antler than just like a space to find a co-founder, right?
Right. Yeah. And so, Jake, curious about how, I'm sure there's so many things that go into it, especially, this early. What, I guess, is the framework for you guys for whittling down as we're getting towards the end of the program and actually making those investments? Like what goes into that thought process? And is it, a standard we're going to do the top 10%, maybe 5 companies? How do you guys think about all of that?
Yeah, it's not standard, and there's a few things we look for when we're underwriting the actual formal investment. But even on the front end, when we decide which founders to bring in, the main things we look for is one, are you uncomfortably ambitious, is the way one of our general partners likes to describe it. One thing I remember about the first meeting with Sabina is that it was kind of like, why do you want to build in healthcare? Like, you've built this great business in gaming. Like, what's the correlation here? And one thing she mentioned was that she was frustrated that the size and the scope of that first company that she built was limited by the size of the games that they serviced, right? So that company couldn't grow any more than that game would grow, essentially. And she was excited about healthcare because the market size is essentially like unlimited. So that's the type of like uncomfortably ambitious mindset that we look for bringing founders in. The second is a biased execution. She had been exploring this space for a while. She had been actively co-founder dating. She was doing the groundwork and legwork to understand how to actually like turn this into a real business. And then last is just first principles thinking and clear thinking, being intellectually honest about areas that she doesn't have the right answer or she hasn't thought through yet because she thinks thinking through this is more important. Those are the qualities we look for on the front end. And then after we work with them on the back end, when we make investment decisions, we're really looking for 3 things, or conviction in 3 things. The first is kind of this core value loop of the business, which we define as like, there's some customer segment. Ideally, it's hyper specific and measurable. That customer segment has a very specific pain point or desire that the company can address with a very specific value proposition, not a product. We see the product more as the technology infrastructure to deliver the value proposition at scale. But what we really care about and are trying to underwrite is like, can Sabina or any founder help us understand like very clearly, like, this is the customer segment, this is this burning pain point they have, and this is how we address it. So that's number one, is conviction in that core loop. The second is show us that they can ship, right, and iterate. And that means usually like pushing code, pushing software, making updates over time, which, as she said, once they picked this space, they had a prototype and 1,000 initial users in like a week and a half or 2 weeks or something. And then third is validation of customer demand, right? Show us that if you are able to build this and people start using it, that you can monetize it in some way. And that can be done in a lot of different ways. It really just depends on the type of business. For big, high ACV enterprise SaaS, that looks more like design partnerships, letters of intent, MOUs, things like that. For consumer applications, it's users, growth rate, things like that. And then for other things, it just varies by business. But when we're making investment decisions, those are the 3 things that we want to have strong conviction in. It's like, 1, what's the core value loop? 2, can you ship and iterate quickly? And then 3, can you validate that customers want this and that they're willing to pay you for it? So that's kind of how we think about it when we get to making the actual investment decisions.
Right. And so, Sabina, I'm curious from your end, going from gaming to healthcare, was there something, I guess, specifically that you had done with that gaming company that you felt confident that you could, translate over? As Jake mentioned, very ambitious, going from 2 separate, completely different industries. Was there something that you were, most confident in that you could I guess, relay into this new industry? And then
Yeah.
following that up, how did you start to get those first initial customers? I think for early stage startups, that's always the most difficult. So curious to hear your thoughts and strategies there.
Yeah. So with my gaming company, in some ways, we're doing the exact same thing. We're empowering consumers with information that they want that adds value, right? So with the gaming company, I think I was confident because we'd had several 0 to 1 products. And one of our larger one, we had taken 0 to 1. In 6 months, we had 1 million monthly active users and we spent $0 on marketing. So my background is in consumer product led growth, right? And so for me, like I think that's my superpower is making things understandable to a wide variety of people. For us, after we launched, we honestly made one Reddit post and got a ton of highly engaged, sometimes super critical, but super constructive feedback. And that's how we got in front of our first 1,000 users.
And I'll say she's understating this a bit. Like Sabina is an expert at using channels like Reddit to market products like this. She actually did a session for other founders, helping share like best practices, tips, and tricks. So this is something that she's like very familiar with and competent around.
Did you guys record that? Because every time I try that, I get banned like immediately.
I mean, yeah, I think it's hard. I think most people struggle with it. I think you have to provide genuine value.
Yeah.
For it to make sense for everyone, right? And I also think I found that I'm particularly uniquely good at writing on Reddit or other social media platforms. I think some of that is that I spent the last 20 years as a woman in games, sometimes like leading a team where there was like less than 1% of women. And so I'm just used to anything that I say or do being extremely criticized, right?
Yeah.
And so like say what you want about like social media or platforms, like you have to write on those platforms in a very strategic way. And not everybody has practiced that skill by being as chronically online as me, right?
Right.
So
No, makes a ton of sense. And then so Jake, on your end, curious about the investment process. Is it, you guys have a meeting at the end? Is it all the same terms for everyone? Do you guys call them into your office and say, hey, we want to invest, or how does that process work?
Yeah, so there's kind of two phases. The first phase is pitching the local investment committee, which is the investment team in each local office. So in the US, we have an office in New York. We also have one in Austin. And then we have, we're going to open up a West Coast office in spring of next year. And so the first step is just pitching the local investment committee. And after having spent those 6 weeks with these founders, there's some portion that we just know that it's not the right fit and we're not going to make an investment. And so we'll be very upfront and direct about that with the founders and say, hey, it's just not the right fit, not the right time, et cetera. We don't want to waste your time and have you pitch us. But for the others, we'll actually run like a formal investment committee process. So we'll block off a 45-minute segment of time. They'll come in, give us a formal pitch as if they've never met us before. So they'll have some form of pitch deck. We'll then ask them questions the way that our full investment committee is going to and any other investment fund will. And then from there, we'll internally decide, okay, of these pitches, what are the ones that we're really excited about, that we have conviction in, that we want to invest in and bring to the full investment committee. And that's the second phase of the process that happens week 8. That's when each local team brings in the companies that they pass through their local IC, and they pitch in front of not just the local investment team, but also the managing director of the US fund and the other general partners in the firm. And in order for the investment to pass, they need to get a majority of votes from that full investment committee. We do have standard deal structure. It's a $500,000 investment. The way that is structured today is $200K upfront as soon as we say yes for 8%. That's a standard post-money safe note. And then $300K of uncapped follow-on. And that's through a 50% match. That's how that's structured and deployed. So what that means is that as founders like Sabina or others go and raise additional capital from angel investors, pre-seed funds, seed funds, et cetera, we'll take those same terms and match 50% of that new capital invested. So they raise 100K at 10, we'll put in 50K more at 10. And we do that because we want to double down on the investments and the founders we're excited about. We also want to make their lives a little bit easier when they're raising downstream capital. They can now say, hey, for every dollar you put in, Antler's going to put in another 50 cents. And also give them ultimate control over the structure and dilution. We're doing so many investments that it would be impossible to negotiate individual
Yeah.
terms on a deal by deal basis. So instead, we're like, hey, we want to double down and back you more. We'll let the terms be up to you in the market. So you kind of get to decide how you want that follow on capital structured and the terms that you wanted invested at.
Yeah, makes total sense. And Sabina, so throughout the program, how confident were you that you were going to, I guess, make it to at least that initial pitch? And then when you did get into that initial pitch, did your strategy change? Did you, use a deck, or did they advise you on those type of things? Just curious how that process went.
I would say going into the whole cohort, I felt confident that I could get investment. That said, like obviously I had to show traction, I had to show progress, I had to work really hard, right? But I felt relatively confident. And then I think there's something that happens halfway through the cohort. If anybody watching is going to go to cohort, you should know this. Around week 3 or 4, everyone goes into like a little depression, right? Because a lot of other companies enter the cohort. For me, like I think probably the earliest company that got investment, that cohort, and one of the earliest companies there, because I was meeting a co-founder there. We were starting from nothing. And there were other companies that had come in with revenue. So suddenly, I think there's a shift in the tone after week 3, 4, where it's like, find your co-founder, make sure you want to be here, like whatever. And then it's like week 3 or 4, it's like, okay, but what results are you showing, right? And so I think a lot of founders during that point were getting a lot more self-doubt. I view that as part of the process, right? Like you're always going to have conviction, moments of doubt. It's sort of like the challenge is how you deal with that and how you move past it. And I think entrepreneurs find ways to solve problems in front of them no matter what. Like they're going to break through a brick wall. Like you have to find a path forward. So I actually think some of that and some of Antler being more hands off during that phase, it's part of a test of this, right? Because you don't always have somebody standing by ready to answer questions and help you like you're in the cohort. It's going to get harder when you have less direction in the future. I would say going into the initial investment to the investment committee, that was what I would call like your standard. Like I presented to a room, did a pitch deck. I think that went well. I did get some feedback that surprised me in between that and doing the national investment committee, which was like, because I was so early, it was like, stop pretending like you know what you're doing, was almost kind of the feedback, right? This is me like, summarizing the feedback that was like more gently dripped into me. But I think when you're so early, the example I give that sometimes makes sense, if you've ever hired or interviewed, sometimes you interview somebody who's like straight out of college and you ask them like, can you do this? Can you do this? Do you have experience with this? And they'll just say, yes, I do to everything, right? Even though clearly like they maybe don't have professional experience, maybe they like dabbled in coding in these languages. And now they're saying like, yes, I know it, right? There's this tendency when you're new to something. And I think founders feel a lot of pressure in front of VCs to be like, it's perfect. I have it all figured out. Like, I'm good. Just invest in me. Like, we're going to go do it all. Right. And the reality is, particularly when you're early, like at the pre-seed stage, you clearly don't have a lot of stuff figured out. And you clearly need to be ready to change anything that's not working and always be evaluating like, okay, well, here's where the temperature is on this. And if, what like things go this way or this way, this is how I think I might react. So it kind of goes back to first principles thinking of like always kind of like questioning things and using your brain, right? Because you can go talk to 100 people for advice about what you're working on, but if you're doing your job right, none of those people should understand your business as well as you as the founder do, right? And they're going to give you opposite advice. So at some point, the founder has to have intuition and conviction and be able to understand this is the advice I'm going to ignore. This is the advice that's like not right, but like there's something going on there. And like, okay, I agree with this advice. Let's do it. Right. So I think going into the pitch, being able to react to criticism and be like, yeah, we haven't figured those things out yet. Right. Our revenue model could totally change. That's totally possible. At least this early, I think, was some of the feedback I got.
Yeah. Jake, would you say it was similar? And then What if that was the main concern, or if there was something else? What did Sabina do that made you guys, I guess, sort of, not feel so strongly about it being a deal breaker?
I think Sabina's right. Like being intellectually honest and first principled is always the right move, especially at these early stages. You don't have all the answers. So instead of trying to make one up, instead just walk us through how you think about it. Because again, we're not trying to underwrite that you have all the right answers. We're trying to underwrite that you can figure out all the right answers iteratively and over time. And that's what we get to observe during the residency. And that's ultimately what we're investing in. So once founders make it past that local investment committee and we say, yes, you've passed, we want to bring you to the full national IC, at that point, the entire local team is like, we want to do this deal. Now we need to help you prepare to pass the national investment committee. Because if you don't pass, we can't invest. And at this point, everyone locally wants to invest in you. And so we collectively, as an Austin team, spent time with Sabina, helped coach her on different things, helped give her some advice on like, hey, if you get asked a question and you don't have like a strong opinion or the exact right answer, just walk us through how you think about it or answer it in that way. And that's going to be a lot more compelling. And those results showed through at the investment committee, at the full national investment committee level. And that's not exclusive to Sabina as well. I think all the founders that ended up passing through had that level of kind of intellectual honesty and first principles thinking when they came to questions where they either hadn't thought deeply about it yet, or they just didn't have a specific answer at this point.
Yeah, I think it's totally fair. It's one thing to just pretend like you know everything versus just admitting that I have a lot to learn and I'm going to learn it. We're going to learn it and we're going to figure it out together. Kind of a side note question for you, Jake, and maybe actually Sabina as well. How do you guys think about investing in co-founders who just recently met? Does that bring any sort of pause, or curious how you guys think about it? Obviously, it's a big part of your program, but yeah, just curious, because that's always one where it's like, how does the team know each other? Are they going to be friends for the next 10 years? So curious about your thought process there.
It's a really great question. Because co-founder matching is like a big component, especially for folks that know that they need some counterpart to pick up the slack in areas where they're not as experienced. I think what we try to dig into throughout the cohort and program, and also just during the investment committee process, is what's it like working together? What's gone well? What are things that you've had to move past? Like, I remember specifically, like, those were all the questions I asked Sabina in the investment committee, right? I had conviction in her and her co-founder Benson's like ability to execute, the opportunity they were going after, the validation from customers. But what I wanted to dig into is like, what's it like working together, right? I think all founders are spiky in certain attributes, and that sometimes makes them difficult to work with. And that's part of what makes them a great founder as well. So really digging into like, how do you navigate the differences in personality? How do you make sure that you're both aligned and on the same page? Like, those are questions that we really try to dig into to build that conviction that, okay, this is a team that's going to last for a really long time. The second thing I'll say is that we provide formats where people get to work together and get to know each other to explore if this is a good co-founder relationship. But we also say really clearly, like, co-founders usually last longer than the average marriage, right? The average marriage is like 4 years or some crazy stat. Like, co-founder relationships, if we're investing, we're hoping y'all are together for 10 plus years. So you want to make sure that it's a really strong relationship and you don't want to rush into it. You really want to be thoughtful about it. So if you don't have like really strong conviction that this is the right person for me, do not rush into it, right? And we don't exclusively invest into people that have co-founders or that met co-founders during the program. It's just another aspect of the environment that we try to create, because we see often there's lots of really talented kind of business-minded co-founders that are really experienced in a space or are really good at talking to customers, shipping product, et cetera, but they need some sort of technical counterpart. And at the same time, there's lots of really brilliant technical people that maybe don't have that business background or that idea that's compelling enough to invest in, but they'd be a really, really talented counterpart for someone who does have that vision and does have that idea. So we try to match make, but we try not to force it. And when there is a match that's made during that residency in that shorter period of time, we really try to dig into what it's like working together. And like, a red flag is if they're just like, oh, it's great, like we're just totally on the same page about everything, because that's just probably not true. And I think, again, when I was asking those questions in the local investment committee, Sabina and Benson were super upfront and honest about like what it's like working together, what have they had to figure out and navigate, and also giving like specific concrete examples of like when they've had to navigate conflict or just come to an agreement where they have differing points of views.
Sabina, anything to add there?
Well, I had two co-founders in my previous company, so I've seen like how it can change over time. And, when everything is going great, personalities that don't get along can get along, right? When everything's growing and things are going great. When things aren't going great, that's when personalities that don't typically get along will really, really not get along. I always describe the co-founder relationship as like being business married, right? You have to have as much conviction as marrying someone. And when I met my co-founder in Antler, we met at the end of the first day and we talked until almost 10 p.m. And then we talked, like we had like loose programming during the day, but at the end of every day, we talked like every day. And we talked a lot initially around our values, how we wanted to see the world change, how we work together, like what's it like when you fire someone, like those kinds of hard questions. I also spoke to people that he had worked with before. I spoke to his previous boss. He was the first engineering hire at a startup and went past Series A. And I talked and I grilled his previous boss on what he could do better and what he could change, right? Because you really want to understand like what are they like at their lowest point? What are they like when they're burnt out? What are they like when they're angry? And I think really great founders have that maturity and self-awareness to know that. And then throughout the cohort, I mean, we work together pretty well. Like we have good interpersonal chemistry, but we disagree on a lot of things. And it's like, how do we handle those disagreements? Because you don't want a co-founder that's pretending to be in alignment if they aren't and isn't willing to disagree. That's a red flag. And then I would say we had conflict near the end of the cohort as we were preparing to pitch. And for me, that conflict was around, do we both want to take VC funding? Are we making a VC scale business? And for me, it's like, do you believe that we can make a unicorn out of this? Because I believe, and I come from, like a sports, esports, gaming background where I've run teams that were the best in the world. It's not enough to have the skills to be the best in the world. You also have to want it. And there's a lot of research that shows in sports science that like, if you like close your eyes and you picture yourself like throwing the ball perfectly and executing whatever you need to do, it actually improves your performance. So for me, from a founder standpoint, if I'm with someone who can't visualize and see a path where we could become a unicorn and they aren't dumb enough to do that with me, then they aren't a good fit for the ambition of what we're doing. Or maybe we could start a company, but maybe it's not a VC scale company, right? And there's nothing wrong with building not at VC scale. But when we're pitching before Antler's investment committee, it doesn't make sense unless we're going to do a VC scale business for us in Antler. And I'm a firm believer whenever I take on capital on my cap table, I'm super picky. Like my other company that's been around for 13 years, excluding employees and employee options, we have like less than 5 people on our cap table, right? So I'm super picky. I want to know that it's accretive for both of us and that we're providing value for both of us. And I think the best relationships in business and anywhere else are providing value for both people. So at the end of the cohort, me and my co-founder were having a lot of really hard conversations, literally in the room full of other people, where I was like, hey, are you dumb enough to start a VC scale business with me? Do you believe it can go to VC scale? Because we've already vetted that we can work together, right? And to me, that was like one of the last conflicts that we had, right, before taking investment.
Yeah, and I think it's an important conversation, right? Because there are 2 different paths. You can make a fantastic business bootstrapping, but if you do take the VC money, things change, dynamics change, and there's just, it's a whole different way to run a business. So I'm glad to hear that you guys did have that conversation early on. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit back towards the national investment meeting. Did you make any strategic changes to your pitch based on, I guess, some of the feedback that you had heard? And then curious how you felt going into that meeting and how that meeting went. And then Did they give you any insight into, okay, we're going to do this, or curious how that process worked for you?
I didn't make major changes to my pitch deck other than I was constantly editing it. For me, I had been practicing it. I didn't want to make huge changes because I think we found out on like a Friday that we were going to pitch, and then we were pitching on Tuesday, and I was like, yeah, I could totally redo this entire deck, as you always could, right? But is that actually going to set me up for success? So for me, I didn't make major pitch deck changes. Actually, one of the things I did strategically, and it was because I was in the office on Monday. And so I saw Antler people like go into meeting rooms, and it was all done remote, and sit on their computer and then come out at the end of the day. And they were like, they looked dead because they'd listened to like 10 pitches that day, right? We can all imagine that's a long day, right? So I saw that and I was like, and this is me being totally stupid. I was like, what can I do to stand out when they're just listening to 10 B2B SaaS AI plays over and over again? How can I be different and how can I wake them up? So actually the really dumb thing I did, I had no idea if this was going to be a good idea or not. I was pitching on Zoom and I played a song, like a dumb song about GLP-1s at the beginning of my pitch. And it was literally like, wake up, I'm different, right? But it was like, it was debated until the last minute of like, can we do this in a way that's additive? Is it worth like the 15, 20 seconds of our tightly timed pitch time to make this worth it? And then I would say I also did background, and I grilled Jake on this. He can attest to this. I was like, who are all the voting members of the IC? What can you tell me about them? What kind of questions are they going to ask me? Like, what do they care about? Always do your prep. Know who's going to be in the room. Know who you need to accommodate. And then because other founders had gone Monday, I grilled every founder that had already been. What kind of questions were you asked? Like, how can I better prep for that? And I guess that's just me being competitive, because that's the same thing I would do if I was in a game tournament.
I think that's what you need to do. Anything to stand out. If you're not coming prepared, you're just doing yourself a disservice, really. And it shows too, like the additional grit and research that you're gonna the same way you're gonna run your company. So kudos to you for that. Did you write the GLP song, or is there already one out there?
No, it was one that went viral like 3 or 4 years ago. And it literally
Okay.
is like, Ozempic, Wegovy, Manjaro, no more sour. Another thing I did, by the way,
Yeah.
I was like, how can I get more FaceTime with these people that I've never met and try to get them to see me as a person and a founder and get excited about me? I made a really long LinkedIn post and published it literally, I think, the day before. So I was like, when they go to prep for my call and they go to my LinkedIn, they're going to see this post. And also the post was about my experience at Antler. So like, because they work at Antler and I wrote a long post about that, they're going to want to read it. And it was really just like telling the story of my journey at Antler in a way that was like about my emotions. So it was me trying to make an emotional connection, and me also telling the story of like why my co-founder and I are such a good match and stuff like that.
Oh,
and so like,
so
I don't know for sure how many people read it, but I'm pretty sure a lot of them at least saw it. Right.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. That's, yeah. Again, anything you can do to stand out. Seems like you did multiple things. Like you said, who knows? But, maybe in the back of their head, it added some sort of determining factor. So
I'll just add that like there were notes in the investment committee where she was asked a question where she just didn't have a strong opinion or didn't have an answer, and she was honest about that. And like people specifically called that out in their votes, in their voting forms. They're like, I love the way this founder is thinking. I love the way that they're approaching this space. And I love that they're not trying to like BS, that they're kind of being open and honest. And that's one other thing that I don't know if Sabina realizes, but that did make a difference on top of all these other little things. Those all added up to be, a yes for the investment committee.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Sabina, I know you mentioned you're very picky about who you add to your cap table. How did you think about filling out the rest of the round, or are you still raising? Curious how that's all going.
Yeah, I still have room in my pre-seed. Honestly, I haven't rushed it because we've been so early. And I've been taking money from strategic angels, and I'm currently raising. I'm talking to, honestly, my whole afternoon is VC meetings. I'm talking to way too many VC meetings. And in between those, I'm doing sales meetings. So like, it's been really hectic in the short term, but we have, room for like another 200K. I might take 250 if it's the right partner. At the same time, like, The angels that we've taken from, we did a 50K minimum, which I know is like atypically high. And we're specifically targeting people who have a specific consumer or go-to-market background because those are the challenges that we have. Or like one of our angels is like a doctor and a co-founder of a telehealth company because they better understand the healthcare space. But generally we want a mixture. And so for me, I'm friends with a lot of angel investors and entrepreneurs in Austin. And so for me, I feel like if I were to make an angel investment of like 10K, I would just forget about it. And that's what I've heard when I talk to people. So I wanted to get people who were a little more engaged with a higher minimum to just extract value potentially out of them and to get more tangible feedback. And I also just don't want, 50 people on my cap table. That's an annoying burden, right? So maybe I'm picky in that way.
No, that's an interesting way to think about that. I don't know if I've ever heard that about, the lower check sizes and they, kind of set it and forget it. And it's so nominal that they're like, I'm not going to go out of my way to help. But if it's, a significant chunk, then yeah, definitely more incentivized to help. That's actually a perfect segue as we wrap up here. So Sabina, if there are any investors, potential customers, partners that are interested in GLP Winner, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn, just Sabina Hemmi. No one else has my name, so.
Okay, cool. And Jake, from your end, if there's anyone who's interested in the next Antler cohort who you think, or who'd be interested in joining, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, they can shoot me an email. My email is jake.o'shea@antler.co, not .com.co. Or LinkedIn as well. There's a few Jake O'Shea's, but they're all like doctors in Ireland. I'm the one that says principal at Antler based in Austin.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys so much. This was extremely fun and insightful, and I appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's a wrap for this episode of Inside the Deal. We hope you learned more about how these rounds really come together.
You're also invited to check out PIN, the easiest way to invest in startups with your community, whether you're accredited or not. Learn more about us at getpin.xyz.
If you enjoyed this episode and are looking for more venture content, make sure to check us out at sandhillmarkets.com. We run a weekly newsletter, live events, investor syndicate, and other great podcasts like this. Thanks for tuning in.